James Cartwright was a man who had spent most of his life climbing the corporate ladder, always striving for success, always chasing the next big project. But after 20 years of living in the fast lane, he found himself worn out, searching for something different. A break, a fresh start. His decision to buy a house in the quiet suburbs was more than just about finding peace. It was about reclaiming a sense of control over his life, stepping away from the constant pressure of high-stakes boardrooms and endless deadlines. The house he chose was perfect. A spacious, two-story home on a secluded street with a private backyard, the kind of place he had always dreamed of. The pool in the backyard was the crown jewel of the property, and James had invested a lot of time and effort into making sure it was exactly as he envisioned. Sleek, modern, and private. A space where he could relax after long days of work. He felt a sense of pride in this home, as if it was finally a place where he could put down roots, a place that was entirely his, where no one could dictate the pace of his life. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood was peaceful, the neighbors polite but distant, and James felt a quiet satisfaction in being able to disconnect from the world. He spent his weekends lounging by the pool, reading books, or enjoying the solitude of his new life. He didn't mind the isolation. In fact, it was a welcome change. But as with all things, the tranquility began to shift, ever so slightly, until it was replaced by something far less comforting. It started with the cameras. James noticed them one afternoon when he was sitting by the pool, basking in the late afternoon sun. At first, he thought it was his imagination. After all, it wasn't uncommon to see security cameras in the neighborhood, especially in an area like this. But then, as he looked more closely, he realized something disturbing. There was a camera positioned on the corner of the house next door, angled directly toward his pool. His first thought was that it was probably a fluke, a strange coincidence. The camera could have been installed for some other reason. Perhaps it was pointed in that direction by accident. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea gnawed at him. There was something too deliberate about the way it was placed. It wasn't just a random security measure. It felt invasive. Over the next few days, James tried to ignore it, but the feeling didn't go away. He kept thinking about that camera, wondering why it was so pointedly focused on his private space. He spent hours by the pool, looking up at the window of his neighbor's house, trying to catch a glimpse of who might be behind it. It wasn't just the camera that bothered him. It was the idea that someone, especially a neighbor, was watching him when he thought he was alone. The invasion of privacy felt like a betrayal, especially since he had made a conscious choice to live in a neighborhood where people respected boundaries. James decided to confront his neighbor, Michael Collins. He had met Michael a few times since moving in. He was an older man, reserved and quiet, who kept to himself for the most part. The kind of neighbor you'd rarely see but knew was always around. James wasn't sure what to expect, but he felt it was the right thing to do. Go over, ask questions, and find out what was going on. When he knocked on Michael's door, the man answered with a polite smile, but there was a certain coldness behind his eyes that James couldn't ignore. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, James brought up the camera, asking Michael about its placement and whether it was intended to watch his property. Michael's response was calm but evasive. He claimed that the camera was there for security reasons, as part of a system that protected the entire neighborhood. "We all look out for each other around here," Michael had said, his tone friendly but with a hint of finality that left no room for further discussion. James didn't feel reassured, though. There was something off about the way Michael spoke. It wasn't just the camera. It was the way Michael seemed too quick to dismiss his concerns, too insistent that everything was fine. James left the conversation feeling more unsettled than before, but it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, James began to notice even more strange occurrences. He'd walk into his backyard, only to find objects slightly moved, as if someone had been there, touching his things. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Perhaps the wind had shifted things, or maybe he had simply forgotten where he placed certain items. But the more it happened, the more he started to feel like he was being watched, and that thought, once planted in his mind, wouldn't go away. James reached out to a local lawyer seeking advice on whether he had any grounds to demand the camera be moved. The lawyer was nonchalant at first, advising him that unless the camera was violating specific privacy laws, there wasn't much he could do. But that didn't sit right with James. He couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was going on. The deeper he looked, the more he realized that his peaceful private life was being encroached upon by forces he didn't fully understand. And this was just the beginning. What seemed like a minor inconvenience was about to spiral into something much larger, something that would test James's resolve and force him to confront the uncomfortable truth about his new home, his neighbors, and his place in this seemingly quiet community. James couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had crept into his life ever since the camera incident. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like his personal space, his sanctuary, was being violated in ways that were difficult to explain. At first, he tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, he was living in a neighborhood where people took their security seriously. It wasn't uncommon for neighbors to install cameras to keep watch over their property, but the more he considered it, the more the placement of that particular camera disturbed him. The angle was too deliberate, as if it had been positioned not just to monitor his backyard, but to observe his private moments. The suspicion gnawed at him, and every time he passed by the window in his living room, he couldn't help but glance at the camera, now a constant reminder that someone might be watching him. The discomfort of it all began to seep into every aspect of his life, clouding what was supposed to be a fresh start. He had already tried to address the issue directly by speaking with Michael, his neighbor, but the conversation had done little to ease his growing unease. Michael had brushed off his concerns so easily, almost too easily. There had been no genuine willingness to understand or address James's discomfort. Instead, Michael's response had been cold and dismissive, as if it was James who was out of line for even bringing it up. That's when it hit James. The realization that something more was at play here, something beyond just a neighbor installing an inconvenient camera. What had seemed like an innocent conversation had instead revealed the first cracks in the seemingly perfect facade of his new life. It wasn't just the camera. It was how everything surrounding it felt calculated, orchestrated in a way that suggested more than a simple mistake. For days after the conversation, James felt a constant pressure hanging over him. The sense of unease he had tried so hard to ignore had now become impossible to dismiss. He couldn't walk around his house without wondering whether someone was watching, whether his every move was being scrutinized. He found himself checking the windows of his own house more often, looking out over his backyard, trying to spot any signs of someone peering into his life. It wasn't just a fleeting thought anymore. It was a constant hum of paranoia, a presence he couldn't shake. It was starting to take a toll on his peace of mind. But what troubled him most was the realization that he had no way of knowing just how deep this invasion went. Was it just the camera? Was Michael alone in this, or was there something bigger happening? Something that involved more people than he cared to admit? James's next steps weren't fueled by curiosity or suspicion alone. They were driven by the growing need to protect himself, to safeguard the last vestiges of privacy he had left. He couldn't stand the thought of being trapped in a situation where his every movement was being watched, where his most private moments were no longer his own. He had always prided himself on being in control of his environment, but now his sanctuary felt more like a fishbowl. He wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't ignore this anymore. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quietly before it escalated further. That evening, as he sat in the living room, James decided to do something he should have done from the start. He called in a professional. Not just any professional, but someone who specialized in security and surveillance systems. He knew that in order to protect his privacy, he needed to understand the full extent of the situation. If there was a camera on his property, how many others were there? Were they all visible, or were some hidden? He couldn't trust that everything was as it seemed. The idea that someone had access to his personal space without his knowledge had sent a wave of anger through him, and now he needed answers. The next day, a technician arrived at his home, an experienced security expert named David, who had worked on high-profile cases involving privacy breaches. David was efficient, scanning the perimeter of the property with a keen eye, inspecting every corner of the house with precision. It wasn't long before David discovered something that made James's stomach turn. There were not just one, but 2 cameras on the property, one aimed at the pool, as he had suspected, and another one cleverly hidden in a tree near the fence line. It wasn't just the placement of the cameras that disturbed James. It was the fact that they had been set up with such expertise. These weren't standard run-of-the-mill security cameras. They were high-quality, professional-grade equipment, the kind that could be remotely accessed with ease, allowing someone to monitor the property without ever having to step foot on it. David ran a few tests on the cameras, and it quickly became clear that they were linked to an off-site server, one that wasn't local, and certainly not part of any standard neighborhood security system. James's heart sank as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about security. This was about surveillance. Someone was watching him, not to protect him, but to control him, to intrude on his life in ways he hadn't even begun to imagine. With the camera system exposed, David turned to James, his expression more serious than before. "These cameras aren't just here to monitor your property," he said, his voice low. "They're meant to monitor you. And from the looks of it, they're connected to something much larger than just your neighbor's interest in security. Whoever set this up knows exactly what they're doing." James felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that someone was watching him, someone who had the expertise to set up such a sophisticated system, was horrifying. But what terrified him more was the possibility that his neighbor, Michael, wasn't acting alone. What if this was part of a larger scheme, a network of people using technology to manipulate and control those around them? It seemed absurd at first, but the more James thought about it, the more it made sense. The cameras, the hidden surveillance, the way Michael had dismissed his concerns, all of it pointed to something more sinister. "Who would do something like this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the words aloud would make them more real. David's face remained grim. "I don't know. But whoever they are, they've been keeping an eye on you for a while, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." James's mind raced, the implications of what he had just learned sinking in. He was no longer just a man trying to enjoy his life in a quiet neighborhood. He was now a target, someone whose every move was being watched, whose privacy was being stripped away piece by piece. And worst of all, he had no idea who was behind it or why. But James wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let things unfold without a fight. He had spent his career making strategic moves, navigating complex situations, and now he was facing something far more personal, a violation of his rights, his safety, and his sense of self. This wasn't just about cameras anymore. It was about taking control of his life back. "I need to know who's behind this," James said, his voice steady, but the fire of determination burning behind his words. "And I'm going to find out." David nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll help you with what I can, but be careful. This kind of thing can get ugly quickly." James didn't hesitate. He knew he was already in too deep. It was no longer just about confronting his neighbor. This was about protecting his freedom, his right to privacy, and his dignity. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him without a fight. As the sun set that evening, James sat in his living room, the weight of the day's discoveries settling over him. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The war for his privacy and for his peace of mind had just begun. James spent the following days with a heavy weight on his chest, as if the world around him had shifted into something darker, more dangerous, and completely out of his control. The knowledge that someone was watching him from the shadows was both unnerving and infuriating. But what bothered him most was the fact that he had no idea who was behind it or what they wanted. He tried to go about his daily routine, but every time he stepped outside, his eyes instinctively scanned his property, looking for any signs of movement, any hint that someone was lurking in the background, invisible but ever present. The 2 cameras David had found weren't the only intrusion. James was now acutely aware of how much his life was being monitored, scrutinized, and possibly even manipulated. He didn't know if his neighbor, Michael, was directly involved in this scheme, but he was increasingly suspicious. Michael's dismissive attitude, the ease with which he brushed off James's concerns, and his calculated nonchalance all pointed to something more than just a neighborly disagreement. James found it hard to believe that Michael, the quiet, reclusive man who lived next door, had set up the surveillance system all on his own. If anything, it seemed like Michael was just a small piece in a much larger puzzle, one that was starting to take shape in the shadows. Determined to get to the bottom of things, James made the difficult decision to escalate the situation. He had already contacted a lawyer, but he realized that legal action, although important, would take time, and time was something he didn't have. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for the system to move at its slow, bureaucratic pace. This wasn't just a case of a neighbor crossing a line. It was something much more sinister. It was about power, control, and privacy, and James wasn't going to let it slide. He had worked too hard to rebuild his life, to create something peaceful and secure, only to have it stripped away by invisible forces. James wasn't a man who liked to play games. He was used to facing challenges head-on, solving problems and taking charge of situations that seemed out of his control. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a corporate merger where logic and strategy would prevail. This was personal, and it required a different kind of thinking, a different approach. James had no idea who was watching him, but he was certain that the people behind the cameras knew exactly who he was, what he valued, and how to get under his skin. His first step was to gather information. He couldn't simply sit back and wait for the pieces to fall into place. He needed to understand who was behind this, who was pulling the strings. With David's help, he had already discovered the cameras, but now he needed to know more. The surveillance system wasn't just a random collection of devices. It was part of a larger network. Someone had orchestrated this, and James was determined to find out who. He began to dig deeper into the history of his neighborhood, looking for any patterns or connections that might explain the unusual surveillance activity. He knew that Michael wasn't the only one with cameras around here, and he began to suspect that other residents might be involved in some way. As he spoke to a few of the neighbors, some of whom seemed more willing to talk than others, James began to piece together a troubling picture. There were whispers of strange behavior, of people who kept to themselves, of properties that were always perfectly maintained and seemingly untouched by time. It was as if the neighborhood had a rhythm, a pattern that everyone followed, but no one ever spoke about. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, James decided to confront Michael again. He knew that the conversation wasn't going to be easy, but he couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the uncomfortable reality that someone in the neighborhood, perhaps even someone he had once trusted, was behind the surveillance. James knocked on Michael's door, his heart pounding in his chest. This time, when Michael opened the door, he didn't offer the same polite smile that he had before. There was no friendly greeting, no warm gesture. Instead, Michael looked at him with a guarded expression, as if he had been expecting this confrontation. "James, what's this about now?" Michael asked, his voice low, almost too calm. "I know about the cameras, Michael," James said, his voice steady but firm. "I know what you're doing." Michael's expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Cameras? What cameras?" James took a deep breath. "Don't play games with me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The cameras aimed at my pool, the ones on my property. I want them removed." Michael stared at him for a long moment, and for a brief second, James thought he might actually get a straight answer. But instead, Michael's eyes narrowed and a smile, cold and calculating, curled at the corners of his lips. "You really don't get it, do you?" Michael said, his tone now dripping with something that sounded almost like amusement. "It's not just about you, James. It's bigger than that. This isn't some petty little neighborhood squabble." James's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell are you talking about?" Michael took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. "You're in over your head. There's a lot more going on here than you realize, a lot more people involved, and you're not going to stop it just by asking a few questions." James's mind raced. "What are you trying to say?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past James, as if considering something. Finally, he spoke again, his words measured and deliberate. "I'm not the one you should be talking to, but I'll give you a little advice. Stay out of this. It's bigger than you think, and you're not going to like where it leads." Before James could respond, Michael slammed the door shut in his face. James stood there for a moment, stunned, the words echoing in his mind. It was as if Michael had just opened the door to a whole new world, a world filled with shadows, secrets, and dangers that James wasn't prepared for. But now he knew he couldn't back down. The game had changed. It wasn't just about cameras anymore. It was about power, and someone was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. In that moment, James realized that he was no longer just dealing with a simple violation of privacy. He was entangled in something much more complex, something that involved more than just one neighbor with a few hidden cameras. Whoever was behind this was playing a long game, and James was right in the middle of it. But there was no turning back now. He had to see it through, no matter the cost. As he walked back to his house, James's thoughts raced. He couldn't let Michael's cryptic warning deter him. He needed to know more. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to stop until he got them. The only question was, how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? And was he prepared for the consequences of what he might find? The days that followed James's confrontation with Michael were some of the most unsettling he had ever experienced. The unease that had lingered for weeks now settled into something deeper, something more urgent. Michael's cryptic words rang in his ears like a distant drumbeat, echoing through his thoughts, a constant reminder that there was something far more dangerous at play than just an invasion of privacy. James had always prided himself on being methodical, calculated, able to solve any problem by breaking it down into manageable pieces. But this was different. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how little he knew, how much he was still in the dark. It had started with the cameras, but now James was facing something that seemed far more insidious. Michael had hinted at a web of people, a system of control that stretched beyond the quiet suburban streets of his neighborhood. He had said that it was bigger than James thought, and now James had no choice but to find out exactly what that meant. The veil had been lifted, but the truth behind it was more convoluted and dangerous than he had ever imagined. James couldn't let the mystery remain unsolved. The more he thought about Michael's words, the more they gnawed at him. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about the camera or even Michael. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface that was slowly revealing itself. Michael's warning had been clear. This was not something he could handle on his own. But James wasn't the type to back down, not when the stakes were this high, not when his very privacy, and, more importantly, his sense of control, was being stripped away piece by piece. The next day, after some deliberation, James took a step he hadn't expected to take. He reached out to an old contact, someone he had worked with in the past, a private investigator named Sam Fisher. Sam had a reputation for uncovering things that others couldn't, for digging into the kind of secrets that people didn't want revealed. He was a quiet man, not flashy or brash, but effective in his work. James knew Sam could help him get to the bottom of this, even if it meant uncovering things he wasn't ready to hear. The meeting took place in a small, unassuming cafe on the outskirts of town, a place James had never visited before but knew would be perfect for their conversation. It was the kind of place where people could speak freely without worrying about prying ears. As he sat down across from Sam, James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just another business deal or a simple investigation. This was personal, and the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it felt. Sam, as usual, wasted no time. He slid a folder across the table to James, its contents already spread out on the page. "This is everything I've found so far," Sam said, his voice low but steady. "It's not much, but it's a start." James opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him. There were pictures of his house from different angles, some taken from a distance, others from up close, almost as if someone had been watching him for longer than he had realized. There were also maps of the neighborhood, highlighting not just his property but several others as well. It wasn't just his house under surveillance. Several other homes in the area had also been targeted, all with similar camera setups, all with the same level of professional-grade equipment. The more James looked, the more it became clear that this wasn't some isolated incident. This was a coordinated effort, one that involved more than just his immediate neighbor. "I'm not the only one being watched, am I?" James asked, his voice tinged with disbelief as he looked at Sam. "This is happening all over the neighborhood." Sam nodded slowly. "That's right, but there's something even more troubling. These cameras are linked to a larger system, one that appears to be monitoring not just your neighborhood but several others as well. I don't know who's behind it yet, but I've traced some of the equipment back to a private company that specializes in surveillance technologies. What's more, they've been operating under the radar, and I don't think they're just targeting random people. There's a pattern to it. Certain people are being watched more closely than others." James felt his heart sink as the full weight of the situation began to dawn on him. This wasn't just about being watched. It was about being controlled. Someone had made the decision to monitor the neighborhood, to keep track of the people's every move, and to do so in a way that was so subtle, so covert, that no one had noticed until it was too late. He looked down at the documents again, searching for answers, but the more he looked, the more questions arose. "Who are they targeting?" James asked, his voice tight with tension. Sam hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I think it's people like you, James. People who are new to the neighborhood, people who aren't already entrenched in the system here. People who might be easy targets for manipulation or persuasion." James's mind raced as he processed this information. He wasn't just an innocent bystander in all of this. He was part of something much larger, something that had been set in motion long before he moved in. He had unwittingly become a part of a game that was being played with his life, and the stakes were far higher than he could have ever imagined. "But why?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do they want with me? What do they want with us?" Sam leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied James. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to find out. There's a lot more going on here than anyone realizes. You need to be careful, James. There's more at stake than just your privacy. There are people involved in this who will stop at nothing to get what they want, and right now, you're in the way." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just dealing with a violation of his privacy. He was dealing with something much more dangerous. These weren't just isolated incidents or overzealous neighbors. This was a calculated, deliberate effort to control, to manipulate, to keep certain people under surveillance, and for what purpose? The more he thought about it, the more questions he had. Who was pulling the strings behind this network? And why was he a target? Sam continued speaking, his voice low and urgent. "You need to start looking at the bigger picture. Don't trust anyone who's too eager to help, and don't trust anyone who seems too nice. This goes beyond your neighbor, or even the cameras. There's a system in place, and it's watching you. It's watching all of us." James's mind raced as he processed Sam's words. He was being watched, but he wasn't just a passive participant. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that he had a role to play in this dark, twisted game. He couldn't turn back now. The pieces were falling into place, but the more he understood, the more dangerous the truth seemed. "I'm not going to back down," James said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "I'll find out who's behind this, and I'll stop them. I won't let them control my life." Sam studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Be careful. You're playing with fire now, James, and once you get too close, it's hard to pull away." As James walked away from the cafe, the weight of the situation settled over him like a dark cloud. He had entered a world he hadn't been prepared for, one filled with secrets, manipulation, and unseen forces pulling the strings. But he couldn't back out now. He had to see it through, no matter the cost. The fight for his privacy, his freedom, and his life had just begun, and he wasn't going to stop until he got the answers he so desperately needed. James's life had become a whirlwind of uncertainty, a constant shifting between paranoia and determination. Every day felt like a battle, an internal struggle between his need to uncover the truth and the overwhelming weight of fear that came with each new revelation. Since meeting with Sam, he had tried to stay focused, to keep moving forward, but the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as an intrusion into his privacy, an uncomfortable awareness of being watched, had transformed into something much larger, more insidious. He wasn't just a target in a simple game of surveillance anymore. He was at the center of a much darker, more calculated web. And every step he took seemed to lead him further into a world he wasn't ready for, a world where control was the ultimate prize, and those who held the reins would stop at nothing to keep them. The first hint that things were escalating came when James received another letter, this one far more threatening than anything he had seen before. It arrived on a Friday afternoon, just after he had returned home from work. The envelope was plain, with no return address, and its contents were simple, yet chilling. "You've been warned. Stay out of what doesn't concern you. If you continue to dig, there will be consequences." It was signed only with a series of numbers and letters, an encrypted message that James couldn't decipher, but one that he knew was meant to intimidate him. The words, though few, carried a weight that made James's stomach twist in a way he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a warning to stop poking around. It was a threat, plain and simple, and one that he couldn't afford to dismiss. James's first instinct was to go to the police, but he knew deep down that wasn't the answer. He had already seen how the authorities had turned a blind eye to his situation. His conversation with Michael had made it clear that he wasn't dealing with something as simple as a neighborhood dispute. This was bigger, and the people behind it were far more powerful than James had ever anticipated. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in the middle of a legal battle that would drain his energy, his time, and perhaps even his safety. He had to take matters into his own hands. But now, he realized, there was no going back. The moment he had crossed into this world, he had crossed a line that was now firmly behind him, and the only way out was to find out who was behind the surveillance, who had orchestrated this twisted game, and why they were so determined to keep him in the dark. That night, as he sat in his living room, James thought back to his conversation with Sam. The private investigator had been clear in his warning. This situation wasn't just about privacy violations or an overzealous neighbor. It was about control, power, and a system that was using fear to manipulate people, to create an environment where those who didn't conform or who were seen as threats could be silenced. Sam had also mentioned that there were others, other neighbors, other people, who were being watched, and that the system had been put in place long before James had ever moved into the house. What Sam had yet to uncover, though, was why he had been targeted. What made him a part of this? Why had the surveillance network been trained on him? It was time for him to take another step, one that would push him further into the unknown. He couldn't just wait for the answers to fall into his lap. He needed to actively seek them out. That's when he remembered the key piece of information Sam had given him. The equipment used for the surveillance had been traced back to a private company, a shadowy firm that specialized in surveillance technologies. James had tried to dig into the company's background, but it was a maze of dead ends and obscured records. The more he searched, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary tech company. It was a company with connections, with resources, and with access to data that shouldn't be available to anyone, let alone a private, unaccountable firm. James's next move was to track down the company's owners, to see if he could find any links between them and the people who were monitoring his neighborhood. It was a dangerous move, he knew that, but he also knew it was the only way to get closer to the truth. Armed with the information Sam had gathered, James contacted a former colleague, a tech expert who had worked in the cybersecurity field and who owed him a favor. James didn't tell him much, only enough to pique his interest and get him started on tracking down the company's ownership records. Days passed, and James could feel the walls closing in around him. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that he wasn't just up against a few rogue individuals. He was up against a well-oiled machine, a network of people who had been operating in the shadows for years, exploiting technology for their own gain. This wasn't just a case of neighbors watching each other or a community with too much time on its hands. This was a calculated operation, one that had infiltrated multiple levels of society, one that had the power to control people's lives without them even realizing it. Then, a breakthrough came. James's tech contact managed to pull up some preliminary ownership information about the company. The owners, it turned out, were linked to a series of shell companies, all with questionable ties to high-level political figures and business leaders. But there was something even more alarming. One of the names on the ownership list was Michael Collins, his neighbor. The revelation sent a shockwave through James. He had suspected that Michael was involved in some capacity, but this was confirmation. Michael wasn't just a passive participant. He was a key player in the network, someone who had the resources and connections to orchestrate this entire surveillance operation. The implications were staggering. Michael had been watching James for a reason. It wasn't just about a neighbor's curiosity. Michael had been carefully selected as part of a larger scheme to monitor specific individuals, to collect data, and to manipulate people who were seen as vulnerable or as potential threats. James's mere presence in the neighborhood had likely been enough to put him on the radar, and now he was being caught in the crossfire of a much larger operation, one that had been going on for years. James realized he had reached the tipping point. He couldn't just confront Michael. He wasn't ready to face someone who had this kind of power. Instead, he had to go straight to the source, to find out who else was involved and what their ultimate goal was. But as he made plans to dig deeper, the danger became even more apparent. The surveillance had already escalated. The subtle threats, the constant feeling of being watched, it wasn't just paranoia anymore. It was real. And the people behind it had a vested interest in making sure James didn't uncover the full truth. The tension continued to mount as James prepared for the next step in his investigation, knowing full well that it wasn't just his privacy at stake anymore. It was his safety, his future, and possibly even his life. He had no choice but to press on. But with every piece of information he uncovered, the deeper he sank into a world where nothing was what it seemed, where every ally was suspect, and where the stakes were growing higher with each passing hour. As the walls closed in, James couldn't help but wonder if he was in too deep, if the fight for his privacy had already cost him far more than he was willing to pay. But there was no turning back now. He was already too far gone, and the only way out was to confront the people behind the network, to face them head-on, and to dismantle the system that had been carefully built around him. James sat at his desk late one evening, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as the weight of his next decision settled heavily on him. He had spent the last few weeks navigating through a maze of surveillance data, hidden connections, and people who had made it their mission to control him. The more he uncovered, the more he realized just how deep the web stretched. How much of his life had been scrutinized and manipulated without his knowledge. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, in the face of this intricate, invisible force, he had to accept that the fight was no longer about reclaiming his privacy. It was about survival. His once peaceful life had been shattered by a surveillance network that had rooted itself so deeply in the neighborhood, and it was clear now that those behind it weren't going to stop unless he stopped them. The realization that Michael Collins was not only a part of the surveillance system, but an active participant in something much larger, left a bitter taste in James's mouth. He had thought of Michael as just another neighbor, someone who preferred to keep to himself. What he hadn't known was that Michael was the orchestrator, the one who had carefully positioned himself to pull the strings of the entire operation. Michael wasn't the only one. As James dug deeper, he uncovered the extent of the connections, the political figures, the corporate sponsors, and even other members of the community who were part of this sprawling hidden network. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit together with horrifying precision, and James realized that the cameras, the covert surveillance, and the threat of being watched had been only the beginning. The true horror of what he was facing came into focus. A carefully calculated system designed to control, manipulate, and suppress anyone who posed a risk to the status quo. The tipping point came when James uncovered a file in the encrypted system that had been feeding the surveillance network. This file contained not just data on him, but on other key figures the network had been watching, people who were seen as unpredictable or disruptive. There were names on that list that James recognized: former business partners, high profile, individuals he had once worked with, and people who had been at the top of their respective fields. But there were also names he didn't recognize. Ordinary people, like his neighbors, whose only crime was being perceived as vulnerable to manipulation. The chilling realization hit him all at once. This network wasn't just interested in gathering data, it was interested in shaping the future, controlling who had access to power, who could rise and who would be crushed beneath the weight of the system. James was now a cog in that system, but he had no intention of being ground into dust. With this knowledge in hand, James knew what he had to do. He had to expose them. He couldn't let this network continue to operate, not when he had seen firsthand how it manipulated people, ruined lives, and worked in the shadows to maintain its grip on power. But exposing them wouldn't be easy. He had no idea just how far this network reached, or how deeply entrenched it was in the political and corporate structures around him. To stand up to this kind of system meant risking everything: his safety, his reputation, and potentially even his life. But as he sat there in his study, staring at the list of names and the detailed accounts of surveillance on his own life, he knew there was no other option. He had come too far to back down now. The first step was to gather evidence, solid, irrefutable proof that could not be ignored. He knew that the authorities, the media, and even some of the people he had trusted wouldn't believe him unless he had undeniable proof. He reached out to Sam, the private investigator who had been helping him navigate this dark world, and together they devised a plan to break into the company's central server, the heart of the surveillance network. It was a bold move, one that carried significant risk. If they were caught, it would be over. But it was the only way to get the truth out, to expose the network for what it was. James couldn't do it alone. He needed Sam's expertise, and Sam needed James's resolve. Together, they had a shot at bringing everything crashing down. The night of the break-in was colder than usual. The air crisp and biting as James and Sam made their way to the nondescript office building where the company behind the surveillance operation had its headquarters. It was late, the streets empty, and for a brief moment, James allowed himself to hope that they might pull this off without incident. But deep down, he knew that hope was fleeting. The people they were up against weren't amateurs. They had planned for this, and James wasn't foolish enough to believe they hadn't prepared contingencies to deal with anyone who dared to expose them. Sam led the way, his movements calculated and precise. They had managed to secure access to the building's security systems, and now they had to move quickly. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity, and James's mind raced with the potential consequences of what they were about to do. But he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. The time for hesitation had long passed. Inside the building, the atmosphere was sterile and impersonal, the quiet hum of computers and flickering lights creating an eerie backdrop as they navigated the labyrinth of hallways. Sam hacked into the central terminal, bypassing security systems with ease, and James kept watch, his senses on high alert. It didn't take long for Sam to find what they were looking for, a hidden file buried deep within the system. It contained encrypted data on the entire surveillance network, including files on Michael, the other key figures involved, and the individuals who had been targeted by the system. As Sam decrypted the files, James's heart pounded in his chest. Every piece of information they uncovered confirmed what he had suspected all along. This network was far more extensive than he had realized. It wasn't just about monitoring people. It was about controlling them, using fear, manipulation, and surveillance to ensure that those who didn't conform were silenced. The names, the dossiers, the blackmail, it was all part of a carefully constructed plan to keep society in line, to ensure that the powerful remained untouchable and that those who challenged them were kept in check. But before they could download the full contents of the file, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. James's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Sam quickly pulled the hard drive from the computer, shoving it into his bag, but James knew they had been compromised. There was no time to waste. They had to get out, and fast. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Sam motioned for James to follow him. They sprinted down the hallway, their hearts racing as they heard the unmistakable sound of doors slamming open, followed by shouts. James didn't dare look back. They had one chance to escape, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. The building's security system had been breached, and the alarm was blaring in their ears as they darted toward the exit. The sound of running footsteps grew louder behind them, and James could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins as they pushed themselves harder, faster. Just as they reached the back door, a figure appeared in front of them. Michael. His face was cold, unreadable, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. Anger, betrayal, and a twisted sense of satisfaction. James had known this moment was coming. He had known that Michael wouldn't let them walk away without a fight. "You're too late, James," Michael said, his voice low, filled with menace. "You've opened a door that should have stayed closed. Now you'll pay the price." But James wasn't afraid. He had already crossed the point of no return. There was no turning back now. And as the world around him seemed to close in, he knew one thing for sure. This battle was far from over. The truth was out there, and no matter how hard Michael and the others tried to stop him, James was determined to expose it, no matter the cost. James stood in the cold darkness outside the building, the hard drive clutched tightly in his hand, his breath ragged as he and Sam made their final sprint to the car parked several blocks away. Behind them, the shouts had quieted, and the building disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the night, but the weight of what they had just done settled heavily in James's chest. He knew there was no going back to any semblance of normal life. That drive didn't just contain evidence. It contained leverage, names, connections, and undeniable proof of the vast and illegal surveillance web that had taken root not only in his neighborhood, but in countless others. And now that he held it, he wasn't just a target. He was the single most dangerous man to the network. But this time, he wasn't afraid. The fear that had stalked him for weeks was burned away, replaced by clarity and grim determination. In the days that followed, James worked around the clock with Sam and a trusted legal contact to decrypt, organize, and verify the contents of the hard drive. The material was overwhelming. Thousands of files, correspondence between operatives, blueprints for network expansion, video footage from private homes, transcripts of illegally intercepted conversations, psychological profiles of residents, and, internal memos detailing methods of social control. The operation was more sophisticated and brazen than James had ever imagined, and it had ties to people far beyond Michael. Local council members, developers, former law enforcement officers, they were all in it, all complicit. This wasn't a simple case of one neighborhood gone rogue. It was a test model for something broader, a controlled environment used to study and condition civilian behavior under covert observation. Rather than going public himself, James made the calculated decision to hand the information over to an independent legal watchdog group known for taking down systemic corruption. They had resources, reach, and the one thing James lacked, anonymity. Within 2 weeks, the story broke across multiple national outlets. Headlines exploded with the scandal. Surveillance state in suburbia. Private company accused of monitoring residents without consent. Whistleblower exposes network targeting civilians. Michael's face appeared on screens across the country, along with several others. Arrests followed swiftly. Investigations were opened. Lawsuits were filed. And for the first time in weeks, James could breathe. His home was no longer a prison. The cameras were gone. The silence that had once felt oppressive was now peaceful again. Neighbors he had never spoken to came forward, grateful and shaken. Many had suspected something was wrong but hadn't had the courage or means to fight it. James hadn't meant to become a hero, and he certainly didn't feel like one. All he had wanted was to live in peace, and in fighting for that he had ended up tearing down a piece of something much larger, something that, left unchecked, could have grown into a monster. James never spoke to Michael again. The last memory he had of him was that cold stare in